Today we're going to talk about scale and spatial illusion in three-dimensional art. So to get started, we're going to talk about scale and proportion. Scale and proportion are related terms, both basically refer to size. So scale is a means of measuring, an instrument or machine for weighing. So I think of a yardstick or a scale that you stand on to measure your weight. So something that measures something. Proportion. Proportion is size measured against other elements or against a mental norm or stand. So this is bigger than this when they are next to each other. So a good example is this image over here by Richard Roth. So we can understand the proportions of these objects based on their relationship to each other. So the black sphere ball thing is much bigger in scale than the little stool. And then not only that, but we're able to kind of put our body in relation to these things because we can understand what size a stool would be against our body. So we're able to kind of scale things not only to each other, but also in relationship to ourselves. We can kind of imagine ourselves in the room and see how large this ball must really be. Okay, how does scale affect art? So to get started, this is a Chinese medallion from the Ming Dynasty. It's about 3 inches across in diameter, so something you could hold in your hand pretty easily. And to imagine holding this object, something that is so detailed, there's a whole world of action going on in this little medallion, but you can simply hold it in your hand. It's almost like the idea of like holding the world in the palm of your hand, or, there's something very delicate and powerful about it, and the scale of this piece really plays a big factor. If it were huge, it would be a kind of a different story, but it's so small, and that creates kind of a more intimate relationship with this little world. So the size of this is a big part of this work. Okay, for this one, we have this piece called Typewriter Eraser Scale X by Klaus Oldenburg and Kahuze van Bruggen. This is a piece in Washington, D.C., so there's tons of other monuments going on around it, and then you have this giant typewriter eraser. And not being someone who uses typewriters, I'm just imagining that this is generally probably a very small piece. It's a small little piece that would probably fit into a typewriter machine with a lot of other pieces. So there's something kind of humorous about taking this small little tool and turning it into this larger than life sculpture. And we know it's large because we can see the trees behind it and the building, and we can kind of imagine walking around it and see how truly, bigger it would be than even us. So the scale of this creates the piece, right? The fact that it's something small that's being made big. That creates sort of a humor, a playfulness. Okay, this is a huge land artwork called Spider. It was created by the Nazca. It's a Nazca earth drawing. It was created between 500 BCE and 500 CE, and it is approximately 150 feet long. So how this piece was made was there was rocks and soil was removed and made an indentation in the earth, and so you can kind of see this value shift. It's lighter where the rocks have been removed, and then darker on the top of the soil, so we can see this spider. So another way to judge scale in this is that you can see there's lots of lines moving around. The lines with 2 lines kind of moving together are tires. They're truck or car tires that are moving around. So when you imagine that, this is much larger than a car. It's a huge piece. And the people that made this piece would never be able to get far enough away from it to even be able to see what this was, right? This is in a really plain area without mountains. You can see that this was taken from a plane. So clearly the scale of this was not human scale. It was the scale of the gods or the heavens or the outer worldly. So they made this, the scale of it is the piece. It's trying to communicate with something that's bigger and larger. So scale in this case is just almost entirely the whole thing. Okay, we're going to talk about how scale has been determined in different types of artwork throughout the centuries. So this is called hierarchic scaling. It's a composition in which the size of figures is determined by their thematic importance. So religious art is a predominant thing throughout history, and the way that they used scaling was really particular. So we can see that the figure in the middle is St. Lawrence. This piece is called St. Lawrence Enthroned with Saints and Donors. The 2 figures on the right are probably the saints, and the tiny little figures on the bottom are the donors. So these are all the same size men, but they are scaled very differently to show importance. Okay, so that was traditional. This is a very, this is breaking the traditions of scaling in artwork. So we come into surrealism. Surrealism is an artistic style that stresses fantastic and subconscious approaches to art making and often results in images that cannot be rationally explained. So this is really breaking the norms of proportion. So here we see this comb is much larger than this bed. The brush on top of that drawer is, just totally out of proportion. So it's creating this really kind of dreamlike, fantastical space that doesn't deal with the normal rational world. And we know that because the scale of the objects are so out of whack. So this is a way of dealing with proportion and scaling that creates kind of an imaginary space and a new way of thinking. So when we think about scale and proportion, there's this long history about how scale should be and what is right. And so this is called a canon. So the canon is a law or accepted code that prescribes a set of standards. So this is a very famous piece that we have over here. It's called The Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. And this is a drawing that he made in his notebook that talked about the precise, perfect scaling for a human. So for example, the body height is 8 heads high. And so if you take the measure of the size of the head and then you multiply that, you'll get a perfectly proportioned body. And then the outstretched arms equal the height of the figure. So he basically was breaking down all these kind of, literal measurements of the human body and creating these kind of perfect standards for how we should have a figure. And Vitruvian, so this is called the Vitruvian Man, this is kind of an homage to this Roman architect Vitruvius, who was the first person to set standards in architecture for perfect architecture or something like that. So there is this long history of perfection, trying to find perfection in scaling and proportion, but we are not necessarily always interested in that. It's just interesting to know that there is that. Okay, illusion of motion. So in all still static sculpture, painting, there is motion going on. It's not maybe always present in the image, but it is happening. So in this, The Kitchen Maid by Vermeer, we see that milk is probably flowing through that. It's not moving in the picture, but we can imagine it. Okay, so this kind of imagined emotion or motion is an important thing. So kinesthetic empathy is a mental process in which the viewer consciously or unconsciously relates or feels an action or emotion they only observe. So whether you've jumped rope or not, you know what's going to happen next. You can feel where these figures are going based on your experience doing it or just your experience seeing it. But this static image or these static figures really kind of imply emotion to them. Okay, anticipated movement, similar to kinesthetic, is the implication of movement on a static two-dimensional surface caused by the viewer's past experiences with similar situation. So again, whether you've played baseball, watched baseball, we know what's happening in this sculpture. We can feel the movement. We can feel what's going to happen in the next moment. Okay, ways to suggest motion in static objects. So this is, you can use repeated figures, so a compositional device in which a recognizable figure appears within the same composition in different positions and situations so as to relate a narrative to the viewers. So in this piece by Devin Ballara, we can see that there's this figure kind of moving in and out of the frame. It almost looks like she's like jumping or something like that. So if one of these frames were isolated, it would maybe be a portrait or someone's sitting, we wouldn't necessarily know that they're moving. But because the figure is repeated, going in and out of the frame, we can see them kind of walking through or jumping through or something like that. You see this a lot in comic books. That's a good way to think about it. Okay, ways to suggest motion. So this cropped figure. So this figure over here, this salad lover, she is really kind of crouched down, and and she's looking upward, which makes me kind of think she's about to go upward. But the figure is so tightly wound around her, and the space is so small around her that we can kind of see that there's something that's going to happen, that she's going to kind of jump out. If she was kind of alone in this big expanse, she maybe would get up, but we wouldn't be able to kind of imply that action, that confined space. All right, ways to suggest motion. So this is how when you take a time-lapse photograph, there's kind of these blurred outlines. So in any form, whether you're doing this in sculpture or in two-dimensional drawing, if you kind of give your figure a little bit of a jagged outline or a blurred outline, it'll kind of give us that feeling that they're moving in and out of some sort of stance. Ways to suggest motion. So this is a photograph of a car called Cadzilla, and It was a custom Cadillac that was made for Billy Gibson, who's the lead vocalist of ZZ Top. So this car has all these kind of lines that are really streaking. So kind of like in the last one, there's these blurred lines. It's almost like that. We can imagine that this car is in motion. It almost is like a teardrop shape. I can picture the kind of car moving, or like this momentum to it. It's streaking through space. So these are fast shapes. Okay, another way to suggest motion is multiple shapes. So rather than having frames where there's different multiple shapes, this is just one figure with multiple shapes within it. So multiple shapes is a visual device used to suggest the movement that occurs when a figure is held in a sequence of slightly overlapping poses in which each successive position suggests movement from the prior position. So we see that with this dancer is kind of moving through this arc shape with her arms. And it's all one figure represented here, but we can feel that she's not multiple, but one figure. Line of force. Lines that show the pathway of movement and add strong visual emphasis to a suggestion motion. So that leg, we can kind of see the directions based on that line of force. So here's another good example. This is New Descending a Staircase by Marcel Duchamp. So rather than just picturing one figure, Marcel Duchamp took this kind of time-lapsed photo and then recreated it in this painting where he's going down the stairs, and you can see that there's these exaggerated shapes, there's these blurred lines, there's repeating forms, there's all these different, ways of showing us that this is a figure that's all about motion.